What if the biggest threat to national security wasn't lurking in the shadows, but right across the counter, ordering pie? This isn't a story about secret agents and clandestine operations played out in smoky backrooms. This is a story about a quiet diner in 1960s America, about the mundane rhythm of coffee refills and daily specials, and about one ordinary waitress who, without a badge, a gun, or even a hint of training, somehow found herself staring down a ghost from the very heart of the Cold War. Her name was Helen. And what she uncovered wasn't just a spy, it was a chilling secret, a betrayal so deep it threatened to unravel a fragile peace. The world saw an ordinary man, a regular customer. Helen saw something else. Something deadly. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if she didn't act, the consequences would reach far beyond her small town, echoing in the halls of power, in the silent fear of an entire nation. This isn't just history. It's a stark reminder of how close we always are to the hidden machinations that shape our world, and how often the most dangerous threats hide in plain sight. The mundane meets the menacing. What kind of man eats the same meal, at the same table, day after day, yet remains an utter stranger? This is the kind of question that doesn't usually keep a waitress up at night. Not in 1962, anyway. Back then, life in America had a rhythm. The world was split in two, us and them. Capitalism and communism. Freedom and the Iron Curtain. Every newspaper screamed about missile gaps and nuclear war. The air hummed with a low-level anxiety, a constant whisper of, "What if?" But in the small, comfortable bubble of her diner, Helen Miller's worries were far more immediate, getting the orders right, keeping the coffee hot, and making sure every customer left with a smile and a full stomach. She was good at her job. Helen wasn't a dreamer. She was a worker. Her life was predictable, reliable, just like the diner itself. She knew her regulars, knew their orders before they even sat down. Mrs. Henderson always took her coffee black. Mr. Johnson always had the daily special, no exceptions. The diner was her stage, her community. And then there was him. He wasn't new. He'd been coming in for months. Always between 7 and 7:30 p.m. Always sat in the same booth, number 7, by the window. Always ordered the same thing, a slice of apple pie, no ice cream, and a cup of black tea, 2 sugars. Every single night. Without fail. He was so consistent, he became another fixture, like the salt shakers or the jukebox. Helen started calling him Mr. Pie in her head. Never Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones, because he never gave a name. Never engaged in small talk beyond, "Thank you, ma'am." He was a man of quiet habits. Too quiet, maybe. His clothes were always neat, a little too formal for a diner in the evenings. A clean, pressed suit, even on a Tuesday. His hair, dark and neatly combed. He never seemed to read a newspaper, never pulled out a book. He just sat, ate his pie with slow, deliberate movements, drank his tea, and watched. He watched the street outside. He watched the other customers. But most unsettlingly, he watched nothing. His gaze was often empty, unfocused, as if he were looking through the diner, through the street, to something far away and unseen. At first, Helen just thought he was lonely. Maybe a businessman traveling, far from home. A man lost in thought. But as the weeks turned into months, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the veneer of his predictability. It wasn't anything big. It wasn't a loud outburst or a sudden change in routine. It was much subtler, much more insidious. One rainy Tuesday night, a car backfired loudly outside, right near his window. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot. Helen saw him flinch, not just jump, but flinch with a kind of primal, instantaneous recoil. His body tensed, his eyes darted, not to the source of the noise, but around the diner, scanning every face, every shadow, as if assessing a threat. It was over in a second. He composed himself, took another bite of pie, but Helen saw it. She saw the flash of something beyond mere surprise. She saw fear. Or more accurately, she saw preparedness. A readiness for danger that was deeply ingrained, almost instinctive. Most people jump. This man reacted like a coiled spring. Another time, a small child, running wild, bumped into his table, knocking his teacup, which clattered but didn't spill. The child's mother rushed over, apologizing profusely. Mr. Pye simply nodded, a thin, almost invisible smile on his lips. But his eyes, again, told a different story. They were sharp, analytical, not warm. He watched the child, then the mother, then the entire diner again. It was a calculating gaze, not an annoyed one. As if he was assessing the security breach, not the spilled tea. Helen started to notice these things. Not because she was looking for them, but because they stood out against the bland canvas of his routine. A man who was so consistent, so unremarkable, shouldn't have these flashes of intense, almost military-grade awareness. It didn't add up. It was a minor discordant note in the otherwise perfect symphony of his habits. The more she noticed, the more the ordinary details of his presence twisted into something unordinary. The way he paid, always exact change, never a penny over or under. The way he folded his napkin, almost geometrically precise, every single time. The way his eyes, when they occasionally met hers, held no warmth, no flicker of recognition, even after months of her serving him. It was like looking into a perfectly polished mirror that reflected nothing. She couldn't shake it. This man, who was supposed to be a regular, a comfortable part of her routine, was slowly transforming in her mind. He wasn't just a weird guy anymore. He was a puzzle. A quiet, perfectly dressed, pie-eating enigma. And the feeling, that deep, unsettling itch she couldn't scratch, told her that this wasn't just about his eccentricities. This was about something much larger, much more significant. The nagging sensation had taken root, growing with every perfectly folded napkin, every razor-sharp glance. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But she knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that something was profoundly, dangerously out of place. The unseen thread. But what happens when an ordinary person stumbles onto a secret too big for them to comprehend? Helen wasn't a spy. She didn't read thrillers. Her knowledge of espionage came from B-movies, and the occasional dramatic newspaper headline about some distant defection. She had no reason to suspect anything beyond a quirky personality. Yet, the small, almost imperceptible threads of suspicion she'd been collecting about Mr. Pye were beginning to weave a pattern. A pattern she didn't want to see, but couldn't unsee. The initial unease escalated during a seemingly insignificant incident. The diner's radio, usually tuned to a local station playing swing and pop, was having trouble picking up a signal. On this particular evening, a technician was trying to fix it, and as he fiddled with the antenna, the radio sputtered, skipping between stations. For a brief moment, it landed on a foreign language broadcast. Helen couldn't understand it, but the harsh, clipped tones were distinctly Eastern European. Russian, maybe. She glanced at Mr. Pye. And that's when she saw it. His reaction was immediate and visceral. His entire posture shifted. His eyes, usually distant, were now fixed on the radio with an almost terrifying intensity. He stopped chewing. His muscles tensed. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Then, just as quickly, the technician fiddled again, the foreign station vanished, replaced by a familiar jazz tune. Mr. Pye blinked. Took a slow, deliberate bite of pie. But the mask had slipped. Helen saw it. He had understood. He had recognized that language. This wasn't an isolated incident. The more Helen watched, the more she saw. She started noticing when he came in. He was always alone. No friends, no family ever met him. He never took calls, never left a message. He was a phantom. His existence seemed to begin and end within the walls of the diner, and a short walk to wherever he was coming from. One evening, he was finishing his tea as a group of boisterous young men from the local college came in, fresh from a football game. They were loud, laughing, full of youthful exuberance. One of them, fumbling with his coat, accidentally jostled Mr. Pye's table. Nothing broke, nothing spilled. The young man stammered an apology. Mr. Pye merely stared, not with anger, but with an almost clinical assessment. And then he did something peculiar. He reached inside his jacket, as if to retrieve something, his hand moving with a speed that was out of place for such a sedate man. He caught himself, paused, and then slowly pulled out a handkerchief, dabbing at his lips. Helen felt a jolt. What was he reaching for? Not a wallet, not a cigarette case. It was a gesture of defense, a reflex, quickly suppressed. It was the movement of a man trained to react, not to simply exist. A tiny, almost imperceptible slip, but for Helen, it was a thunderclap. Her gut clenched. This wasn't just a weird guy anymore. This was a man with secrets, deep, dangerous secrets. And that movement, it spoke of something far more sinister than loneliness. It spoke of training, of a hidden life. She began to test him, subtly. One night, as she brought his pie, she intentionally dropped a sugar packet next to his hand, making a small, soft thud. His hand, resting on the table, didn't flinch, but his eyes, almost imperceptibly, flicked downwards, assessing the packet, then quickly up to her face. Then a sweeping glance around the diner. A tiny, controlled micro-expression of alert vigilance. Most people would just glance at the dropped packet. He treated it like a potential threat. The pieces were beginning to connect in her mind. The rigid consistency. The flinch at loud noises. The foreign language recognition. The defensive reflexes. The blank, unreadable eyes. And the way he observed everything, always, without ever seeming to participate. He wasn't just a quiet customer. He was an observer. A watcher. And in the paranoid landscape of the Cold War, there was only one kind of person who fit that description so perfectly. A spy. The word echoed in her mind, a cold, hard knot forming in her stomach. A Soviet spy. It sounded impossible. Absurd. This was a small town, a simple diner. Not the stuff of international intrigue. But the evidence, small and anecdotal as it was, pointed to one terrifying conclusion. He wasn't just passing through. He was here. Operating. And he was sitting, night after night, in her diner, eating her apple pie. The realization brought with it a profound sense of isolation. Who would believe her? An ordinary waitress, with a hunch about a regular customer? They'd laugh her out of town. Tell her she'd been watching too many movies. But the feeling was too strong, too persistent to ignore. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this man was not who he seemed. And that knowledge, that unseen thread she had accidentally plucked from the fabric of his disguise, now bound her to a danger she was entirely unprepared for. It became her burden, a heavy secret she now carried alone. The Cold War whispers. In a world gripped by nuclear dread, how could a small-town waitress possibly recognize the silent language of espionage? The Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical struggle played out by presidents and generals. It seeped into the very fabric of American life. It was in the duck-and-cover drills at school, the backyard bomb shelters, the constant news reports of Soviet aggression, and the chilling phrase, mutually assured destruction. Paranoia was a national pastime. The enemy wasn't just across the ocean, he was everywhere. He could be your neighbor. He could be a perfectly normal-looking stranger. And for Helen, that theoretical enemy was suddenly, terrifyingly real. He was Mr. Pye. She grew up with this fear. Her father, a World War I veteran, often spoke of the communist menace with a gravitas that made it sound like a biblical plague. She remembered the McCarthy hearings, the whispers of traitors in every government department. The fear was insidious, abstract. Now it had a face that ordered apple pie. Her mind raced, connecting the dots that the newspapers and newsreels had laid out. The quiet, unassuming nature of spies, their ability to blend in, their meticulous routines, their lack of personal connections. All the characteristics that made Mr. Pye weird regular now painted him as a textbook, almost cliché, enemy agent. It was almost too perfect. Too obvious, perhaps, but that's what made it so effective. Who would look for a spy in plain sight, in a diner booth, every single night? The burden of this knowledge began to weigh on her. Every time she saw him, the familiar aroma of coffee and frying bacon seemed to curdle with the scent of fear. Her friendly banter with other customers felt hollow. She was living two lives, the smiling, efficient waitress and the amateur detective harboring a terrifying secret. The question gnawed at her. What was he doing here? This wasn't Washington, D.C. This wasn't New York. This was a small industrial town, known for its textile mills and sleepy Main Street. What valuable information could possibly be here? This was where the too big to comprehend part of the secret came into play. If he was a spy, his presence here meant something significant was happening in her town. Something that made it a target for the Soviets. She started paying attention to things she'd never noticed before. The hushed conversations among the engineers from the nearby aerospace plant, who sometimes stopped for breakfast. The occasional presence of military personnel from the small training base 30 miles out. Was Mr. Pye observing them? Was he listening? Was he waiting for something? Or someone? Her heart hammered every time she approached his table. She imagined scenarios. What if he knew she suspected? What would he do? The Cold War rhetoric painted Soviet agents as ruthless, faceless enemies. Was her life in danger? The thought was absurd, terrifying, and impossible to shake. She was just Helen, a waitress. Yet, this fear, this deep, gnawing anxiety, also sharpened her senses. She became hyper-observant. She noticed that sometimes, after he finished his pie, he would sit for an extra 5 minutes, staring out the window, occasionally scratching a seemingly random mark on the condensation of the glass with his finger, before wiping it away. A nervous habit? Or a subtle signal? To whom? For what? The thought of going to the authorities felt overwhelming. Who would she even call? The local police? They'd laugh. The FBI? How would she even get their attention? What proof did she have? A man who likes pie and is a little too quiet? It sounded insane. She had nothing concrete, just a collection of gut feelings and subtle observations. No files, no hidden cameras, no secret documents. Just the chilling conviction of a woman who saw through the disguise. But the alternative was worse. To do nothing. To let him continue, whatever he was doing, in her town, under her nose. To ignore the danger that her instincts screamed was real. The Cold War wasn't just headlines. It was a silent battle, fought in shadows, in everyday places. And suddenly, her diner, her quiet, safe diner, was on the front line. The burden of this secret was crushing. It kept her awake at night, replaying every interaction. Every glance, every small, unsettling detail. She realized she couldn't dismiss it. She couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. Her town, her country, were at stake. And for some inexplicable reason, she, Helen Miller, the waitress from the diner, was the only one who saw it. The weight of this realization settled deep in her bones. She knew she had to do something. But what? How do you catch a ghost, especially when you're just a waitress, and the ghost is a Soviet spy? The answer, if one existed, remained shrouded in shadow, waiting for her to find it. The risky gambit. How do you prove the invisible, especially when the invisible is hiding in plain sight, and the stakes are nothing less than national security? Helen couldn't just walk into the FBI office and say, "There's a Soviet spy eating apple pie in my diner." She'd be laughed out of the building, dismissed as a hysterical woman. She needed proof. Something tangible. Something that wouldn't make her sound like she'd gone mad from too many late nights and too much coffee. But how does a waitress, armed only with a coffee pot and a sharp intuition, gather intelligence on a trained agent? This wasn't a movie. There were no hidden cameras, no fingerprint kits under the counter. There was only Helen, her growing certainty, and the escalating fear that every passing night brought the world closer to whatever threat this man represented. The weight of her secret had become a physical burden. Her shoulders were constantly tense, her sleep restless. Every time the phone rang, she flinched, expecting a strange voice, a coded warning. She saw Mr. Pye not just as a customer, but as a ticking time bomb. The thought that he might be transmitting vital secrets from her workplace, using her coffee shop as a hub for espionage, was a chilling reality she couldn't escape. The sheer audacity of it infuriated her. Her diner, her sanctuary, was being desecrated. This fueled a new kind of determination, pushing her past her fear. She wasn't just defending her country. She was defending her home. Her strategy, if it could even be called that, was born of desperation and her unique position. She decided to observe, yes, but also to interact. To gently, cautiously, push the boundaries of his impenetrable routine, to see if she could force a larger crack in his facade. It was a terrifying prospect. She imagined his trained eyes seeing through her every move, his cold analytical mind dissecting her intentions. What if he realized she knew? The thought sent a fresh shiver down her spine. The consequences of exposure would be swift and brutal, she was certain. But the alternative, doing nothing, was an even heavier weight on her conscience. The first attempt was subtle, almost accidental, but pregnant with meaning. One evening, as she delivered his usual pie and tea, she, accidentally, brushed against his arm, causing a tiny ripple in his meticulously ordered world. It was nothing. A common occurrence in a busy diner. She murmured a quick apology, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But she watched him. His muscles, for a split second, tensed, like a cat about to pounce. His eyes, for another split second, scanned her face, then the room, then back to her arm. No anger. No surprise. Just a cold, calculating assessment. He was measuring her. Testing her. Or perhaps, she thought with a renewed chill, he was simply always on guard, always ready. He mumbled a polite, "Excuse me," and returned to his pie, his composure instantly restored. Helen walked away, her hands slightly damp with sweat, feeling like she'd just defused a bomb with a hair trigger. She had learned nothing concrete about his mission, but confirmed everything about his hypervigilance. He was a trained professional, deep in enemy territory, and he never let his guard down. Not for a second. The next step was more deliberate, more targeted. She needed to test his knowledge, his understanding of the local environment beyond what a casual visitor would grasp. One night, a local news report was playing softly on the small TV behind the counter, detailing a minor local dispute about a new road project, a typical small-town squabble over budgets and zoning. As she refilled his tea, she casually remarked, "Can you believe they're arguing about that old road again? It's been going on for years. Such a fuss over nothing." She kept her tone light, conversational, The kind of small talk she'd make with any regular, trying to appear completely oblivious to any deeper implications. His response was immediate and chillingly precise. Indeed, ma'am. Such infrastructure debates are often protracted when local and federal interests clash, particularly concerning economic development and logistical priorities for industrial zones. He spoke without a pause, his English perfect, his vocabulary surprisingly formal for a casual diner chat. He didn't sound like a local, someone who had lived with this dispute for years. He didn't sound like someone who'd picked up the local gossip from a barber shop. He sounded like he'd read a briefing, a classified government report. It was the detached, analytical tone that struck her. He wasn't participating in the local complaint. He was analyzing it. And he had understood the nuances of local and federal interests and industrial zones immediately, connecting a mundane local squabble to strategic implications. He wasn't a passing tourist. This was a man who studied his environment with intense purpose, assessing its vulnerabilities and its assets. This interaction solidified her fear. He wasn't just a random oddity. He was active. He was gathering information. And she, Helen Miller, had just confirmed his alarming level of understanding and his ability to see beyond the surface. A wave of vulnerability washed over her. Every word she spoke, every interaction, could be misconstrued, could expose her. The diner, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a place where she was constantly watched, constantly scrutinized. She tried another angle, looking for an opening in his impenetrable facade. She noticed he never used the phone booth, never sent or received mail at the diner, and never seemed to have any personal belongings beyond his perfectly pressed coat and hat. He was untraceable. A ghost. What if she made him need something? Something small, something a normal person would ask for, something that would force him to deviate from his silent, self-contained routine. One particularly cold evening, as he was finishing his meal, she strategically placed a small, local newspaper, the kind full of local gossip, high school sports, and small-town ads, on the table next to his booth, almost as if she'd forgotten it there. She walked away, pretending to be busy with other customers, but her peripheral vision was locked onto him. He ignored it for a long time. Then, just as he was about to get up, his eyes flickered down. His gaze lingered on an advertisement for a new electronics store that had just opened in town, promising cutting-edge technology and state-of-the-art components. He picked up the paper, folded it neatly, almost geometrically, and placed it inside his coat. He still didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her. But he took it. He needed something from that paper. The advertisement. The promise of new technology. This was a major breakthrough. It wasn't apple pie or black tea he was interested in. It was something specific, something tied to the town's industrial output. The aerospace plant. The research facilities. He wasn't just a passive observer. He was actively seeking information, even from something as mundane as a local paper. The cutting-edge technology advertised wasn't for household appliances. It was potentially for the components of a new radar system, a guidance computer, or some other critical defense technology being developed nearby. Helen's initial fear began to transform into a steely resolve, a simmering anger. This man wasn't just an enigma. He was a clear and present threat to everything she held dear. And he was getting away with it, right under everyone's noses. She was still alone in her suspicion, still without concrete proof that would convince official channels. But she had seen enough. The subtle flinches, the precise language, the sudden interest in technology, the absolute lack of personal trace. It all added up to one undeniable conclusion. She couldn't go to the authorities with just a feeling and a few anecdotal observations. She needed something undeniable. A piece of physical evidence. A clear, unambiguous signal that even the most skeptical agent would understand. The risky gambits had confirmed her suspicions, but they hadn't delivered the smoking gun. Not yet. She knew she had to go bigger. Much bigger. The next move had to be decisive. The unraveling. What was the one thing even a master of disguise couldn't hide, especially when his world revolved around rigid, unbending predictability? Helen understood routines. She lived by them. The diner opened at 6 a.m., closed at 11 p.m. Coffee brewed at certain times. Daily specials changed with the market. But Mr. Pie's routine was different. It wasn't a rhythm, it was a cage. A meticulously constructed prison of habit designed to deflect attention, to make him unremarkable. He ate the same thing, at the same time, in the same booth. Every single night. This absolute predictability was his greatest strength, his perfect camouflage against suspicion. But Helen, the seasoned observer of human habits, the woman who had spent years anticipating every customer's need before they voiced it, realized it was also his fatal flaw. A perfectly straight line is the easiest to break. She needed to exploit that rigidity. She needed a way to break through his defenses. Not by force or confrontation, but by a subtle, almost imperceptible twist of his own habits. The answer came to her one quiet afternoon, as she was wiping down the chrome counter, watching the city bus pass by, always at the same time. The mail delivery. The milkman. All these things operated on a fixed, unyielding schedule. Just like Mr. Pie. And just like those things, a tiny alteration could throw the entire system off. What if she changed his schedule? Not overtly, not by denying him service, that would be too confrontational, too noticeable. But by a subtle, disruptive act that would force a reaction, a deviation from his programmed response. She thought about his precise payments, his perfectly folded napkin. He was a man who hated disorder, who craved control. He was the kind of man who would notice a single misplaced crumb. Her plan was simple, audacious, and profoundly risky. It involved the one thing Mr. Pie consistently held onto, the one thing that seemed to anchor him to his routine, his tea. Not the pie, which varied slightly in shape and texture depending on the baker. But the tea. Black, 2 sugars. Always. A tiny, insignificant detail to anyone else, but to Helen, it was the chink in his armor. One evening, as he sat in his booth, precisely between 7 o'clock and 7:30 p.m., she brought his usual order. Pie. Tea. But this time, she delivered the tea with only 1 sugar. She placed it before him, her heart thumping a frantic drum solo against her ribs, her face a mask of practiced neutrality, a smile pasted on. She walked away, pretending to attend to other customers, wiping down the counter, refilling salt shakers, but her eyes were fixed on him. He picked up the cup. He stirred it. His eyes, usually blank, narrowed almost imperceptibly. His hand paused for a fraction of a second mid-stir. He took a sip. His body stiffened, a minuscule, controlled movement. He put the cup down. Helen saw it. A tremor of irritation. A flicker of something close to alarm crossed his face. This was not just a preference. It was a breach of his personal, predictable order, a violation of his meticulously constructed environment. He looked around the diner, his gaze sweeping over the room, settling on her for a fraction of a second before moving on. It was a clear signal. Something was wrong. His routine was broken. His cover was being subtly, delicately, but undeniably challenged. He didn't complain. Of course not. That would draw attention. That would be human. That would break his cover. But Helen knew she had him. He was out of sync. His internal clock, his meticulous expectations, had been disrupted. The perfect machine had a tiny, almost invisible, cog out of place. She waited. The tension was almost unbearable. Then, she walked back to his table, her walk a careful balance between professional nonchalance and a hunter's precision. "Everything all right, Mr. Pye?" she asked, her voice calm, innocent, laced with just enough warmth to be believable. He paused. His jaw worked, almost imperceptibly, as if chewing on the words before speaking them. "The tea," he said, his voice low, controlled, but with an edge she hadn't heard before, a brittle frustration, a barely contained irritation. "It appears to be missing something." The phrasing was so formal, so indirect, yet so clear. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir," Helen exclaimed, feigning distress, bringing her hand to her mouth in a perfectly orchestrated gesture. "My goodness, I must have been distracted. Please forgive me. Let me get you another sugar right away." She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a single sugar packet, and with a practiced, apologetic flourish, placed it on the table. He picked it up. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. And in his eyes, for the first time, Helen saw not just cold calculation, but a flash of something akin to recognition. Not of her as a person, but of her intent. He knew she had done it on purpose. He knew she was testing him. He knew she was a threat. And in that moment, the delicate dance between them shifted. He was no longer just the spy pretending to be a regular. She was no longer just the waitress. They were adversaries. The game was unveiled. He added the sugar, stirred, took another sip. But the aura around him had changed. The perfect camouflage was gone. He was exposed, not by what he did, but by what he didn't do. He didn't correct her directly, he didn't make a fuss, he maintained his cover. But the stress of that slight deviation from his rigid routine had forced a momentary, telltale crack. He was rattled. The next night, Helen upped the ante. This time, she brought him the pie, but intentionally left his tea off the tray entirely. She placed the pie, said, "Enjoy," her smile a little too bright, and walked away. The silence from his booth was deafening. Other customers chattered, dishes clanked, but Mr. Pye sat motionless. She waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity. He wasn't going to call her over. He wouldn't risk drawing attention. He was caught. His routine was shattered, his control slipping. Finally, after what felt like an hour, but was likely only a minute, she turned. "Oh my goodness!" she gasped, rushing back to his table, her face a mask of perfectly feigned horror. "I am so sorry, sir. My mind must be elsewhere tonight. Your tea." She reached out, picked up his empty cup, and as she did, her hand subtly brushed the underside of his table. Her fingers found it. Taped securely beneath the table, hidden from casual view, was a small, smooth metal disc. Cold to the touch. It was professional, designed to be discreet, almost seamless with the table's surface. A miniature camera? A listening device? A radio transmitter? She didn't know the specifics. But she knew it wasn't a lost button. It wasn't a piece of gum. It was clearly a piece of specialized equipment. Carefully, deftly, her palm concealing it, her thumb working the sticky adhesive, she peeled it off the tape. She kept her face impassive, her apology still flowing, rushed to the kitchen, and placed the small device into a sugar canister, pushing it deep beneath the white granules, out of sight. She returned with his tea, perfectly black, 2 sugars. She set it down. Their eyes met again. This time, there was no mistaking the raw, dangerous knowledge in his gaze. He knew. He knew she had found it. The silent agreement between them, the unacknowledged game, was over. He watched her. His face, still impassive, now held a cold, predatory focus. He knew. And Helen knew he knew. The disguise was unraveled. The subtle game was now a perilous reality. His eyes held a silent question, "What now?" And hers held a single answer, "You're done." The aftermath and echoes. What happens when an ordinary truth exposes an extraordinary lie, and the quiet heroism of a simple waitress becomes a linchpin in a global struggle? The air in the diner that night felt thick, charged with unspoken tension. Every clatter of a plate, every burst of laughter, seemed unnaturally loud, starkly contrasting with the silent war being waged between Helen and Mr. Pye. Helen continued her work, serving customers, clearing tables, but her every move was imbued with a heightened awareness, a desperate need to appear normal. She felt Mr. Pye's gaze on her, a constant, chilling presence that pricked at the back of her neck. He finished his pie, drank his tea. He paid, as always, with exact change, laying the coins out with unnerving precision. He left his napkin perfectly folded on the table, a final, defiant act of his meticulous routine. And then he stood. He paused at the door, turning his head slightly. Their eyes locked one last time across the expanse of the diner. There was no menace in his expression, no overt threat, no rage. Only a deep, unsettling understanding. It was a silent acknowledgment of defeat, and perhaps a chilling promise of something more, something unsaid, something about the consequences of her actions. Then he was gone, disappearing into the cold, anonymous night, a phantom melting back into the shadows from which he came. Helen didn't move for a long moment. The clang of the kitchen, the laughter of a couple sharing a milkshake, all faded into a distant hum. The small metal disc was still hidden in the sugar canister, a tangible piece of proof. But her biggest fear wasn't about the evidence anymore. It was about him. He knew she had it. He knew she was onto him. What would he do? Would he return? Would he send others? The quiet, everyday rhythm of her life had been shattered, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of Cold War espionage. The next morning, Helen didn't wait. The fear was too great, the burden too heavy. The device was too real. She called the local police, her voice surprisingly steady, then, summoning every ounce of courage, asked them for the number for the federal authorities. She explained, succinctly, calmly, how she believed she had a piece of equipment from a Soviet spy, detailing her observations without theatrics, sticking to the cold, hard facts. They were skeptical, of course. A waitress? A spy? It sounded like a pulpy novel. But the sheer conviction in her voice, the logical progression of her observations, and the mention of a device that she had in her possession must have sparked something beyond mere dismissal. Within hours, 2 grim-faced men in dark suits arrived. They weren't from the local precinct. They identified themselves as FBI agents, their names and faces as unmemorable as Mr. Pye's. Helen led them straight to the kitchen, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and triumphant relief. She pulled out the sugar canister and, with a trembling hand, retrieved the small metal disc. Their eyes, previously bored and skeptical, widened. One of them immediately recognized it. It was a sophisticated, miniaturized burst transmitter designed to send short, encrypted messages in rapid bursts, making them incredibly difficult to intercept and trace. Cutting-edge Soviet technology. And it had been broadcasting from her diner, right under the nose of unsuspecting America. The revelations that followed shook her small town to its core, though few ever knew the true extent of it. The Mr. Pye, who had been a quiet regular, was, in fact, a high-ranking GRU, Soviet military intelligence, officer named Anatoly Volkov. His sophisticated cover story was as a traveling textile machinery salesman, a perfectly plausible excuse for his solitary routine and his lack of personal connections. And his mission? Not to spy on local gossip, but to monitor the nearby aerospace plant, a key player in the development of classified rocket technology for NASA and the nascent Intercontinental Ballistic Missile (ICBM) program. The diner, strategically located on a main road with clear lines of sight, offered an ideal, inconspicuous location for regular transmissions. The device had been transmitting nightly, relaying sensitive information about production schedules, material transfers, and even personnel movements, a critical pipeline of intelligence flowing directly to Moscow. Helen's careful observations, her daring gambits, and her final, brilliant, risky move with the sugar packet and the hidden device had not just exposed a spy, they had uncovered a vital link in a much larger Soviet intelligence network operating in the heart of America. Volkov was arrested that night, not in the diner, but at a discreet safe house several blocks away, before he could attempt to flee or activate any dead man switches. The capture, kept highly classified for decades to protect ongoing investigations, and to avoid giving the Soviets insights into American counterintelligence methods, was a significant win for American counterintelligence during a critical, tense period of the Cold War. It potentially saved countless American lives and billions of dollars in defense. Helen Miller never became a celebrity. Her name wasn't splashed across newspapers. The government kept the details of Volkov's capture under strict wraps, citing national security. She was debriefed extensively, thanked profoundly by some very powerful, anonymous individuals, and asked to maintain absolute secrecy. The small town never knew the true story of its quiet waitress and the quiet man who loved apple pie. They never knew how close they had come to being a pawn in a global chess game. But for Helen, life was irrevocably changed. She continued to work at the diner, serving coffee and pie, but her perspective was different. Every stranger held a new potential, a new secret. Every routine, a hidden meaning. She had stared into the cold, calculating heart of the Cold War, and found a piece of it, a crucial, hidden mechanism, in her own hands. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a quiet hero, a guardian on the front lines of an unseen battle, proving that courage, observation, and an unwavering moral compass could be found in the most unexpected places. Her ordinary life had touched the extraordinary, and she had emerged, silently victoriously. Her story isn't just a footnote in history. It's a powerful testament to the fact that during times of great conflict, the most pivotal moments often unfold in the most mundane settings, driven by the most ordinary people. It reminds us that heroism wears many faces, and sometimes it looks like a waitress pouring you a cup of tea, noticing the one sugar that's missing. It reminds us that eternal vigilance isn't just for generals and presidents. It's a responsibility we all share, a quiet strength that can turn the tide of history. The biggest threats are often those we never see coming, hidden in the comforting rhythm of the everyday. This story is just one example of the countless hidden battles fought during the Cold War by ordinary citizens. If you're fascinated by these quiet heroes and the complex psychological games played during this era, you won't want to miss our next deep dive. The librarian who deciphered Nazi codes in her spare time. Click here to watch and discover another incredible tale of an unsung hero who changed the course of history from behind a desk.